Writing on the wall, writing on the wall. Focus question. How does Trisha discover who wrote the message and what does she learn about both herself and the person who wrote it? Trisha pushed piles of blankets and clothing aside. She was searching for her winter coat on the disorganized shelves of her bedroom closet. As a stack of folded sweaters tumbled off the shelf, Trisha noticed a series of faint markings on the wall. She pushed her search and peered into the shadows. She could barely make out the markings, but it seemed as though it could be writing. This was definitely more interesting than finding her coat. Trisha grabbed a flashlight so she could look more closely. Trisha's family had moved to the Bronx from Brooklyn, another borough of New York City, early that year. They had remodeled their entire apartment, but this section of wall and apparently survived. Trisha's neighborhood was changing quickly. Almost every week, it seemed as though a new family was moving in and renovating another apartment. Everywhere she looked, he saw shiny new buildings and businesses, but here was a little piece of history. Who was MJ? Trisha thought of her great-grandmother, who had immigrated to the United States from Ireland as a young girl. Maybe MJ's experience was similar. Trisha read the message again and imagined it was written by a young Irish girl named Margaret Josephine, who had arrived in the United States in 1843. What would it feel like to cross an ocean to live in a new, unfamiliar country? Would it seem like a thrilling adventure or a terrifying unknown? Trisha imagined that MJ loved living in New York and that the message in the closet was a goodbye poem to her previous life. That weekend, Trisha went to the public library to research the history of her neighborhood. Old photos showed horses walking down a street and a steel mill had been where the new skyscraper stood now. There had been Irish immigrants. Later, mostly Latin Americans lived there. Trisha imagined another story for MJ. This time, she pictured MJ as a 13-year-old boy named Marcos Zerez. Zerez, who was originally from Puerto Rico. A kid from Puerto Rico, Trisha thought, would probably hate the freezing temperatures and dirty snow in New York. Maybe he hated the bustling city and wanted nothing more than to return to Puerto Rico in 1943 when he was young enough to go on his own. That night at dinner, Trisha asked her parents about her building. Who lives here before us? It was a rental unit, so lots of different people probably lived there. I lived here, Mom answered. How old is the building? Oh, maybe 100 years old, Mom said. Trisha quickly did the math in her head. It must be 1943, she murmured. What's 1943? Dad asked. The message on the wall. Her parents were instantly curious, so they all left the dinner table and squeezed into the closet together. 43? 43? That's World War II, Mom said. It could be someone who enlisted into the Navy, Dad suggested. Can we look up people who joined the Navy in 1943? Trisha asked. The three of them gathered around Mom's computer to research military records. Immediately, her parents' excitement faded. Wow, 86,000 people? Mom said. Trisha was determined to find MJ. Can I look? She said. Be my guest. Trisha clicked, scrolled, and skimmed hundreds of names until bedtime. Then past bedtime, she found an old census which listed every household by address. The census didn't include apartment numbers, though. She read scans of handwritten documents until her eyes glazed over. Her back ached, and her fingers felt stiff. Finally, she counted 6 families who had lived in her building and had last names beginning with J. Suddenly, Trisha said the name Murray Johnson, and then a few minutes later, Marcus Jones. They had both enlisted in 1943 and they had both lived in her building. Without apartment numbers, though, there was no way to determine which one had written the poem. Trisha wondered if Mary Johnson was her MJ. She thought of Mary as a 19-year-old who had just enlisted. Mary would have been proud to serve her country. But that didn't mean she wasn't nervous about her future. Trisha imagined Mary's fingers trembling as she wrote the message on the wall. Maybe she wrote it to convince herself to be brave. The next day, Trisha searched for Mary Johnson. She could still be alive, and Trisha wanted to know why she had written the message. Almost as soon as she began her searching, Trisha groaned. Mom peered into the room. Hit a dead end? There are thousands of Mary Johnsons, Trisha complained. What about Marcus Jones? Mom asked, pointing at Trisha's notes. As Trisha typed the name, her shoulders slumped. There were thousands of results of the name, too. Mom looked over her shoulder for a few minutes. She pointed to one of the results. This one's just south of here in Harlem, she said. Trisha was thoughtful. Still, she decided to write a letter. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Where had MJ gone? Trisha tried to picture Marcus Jones. She couldn't imagine what it might feel like to leave behind her home and family to go to war, not knowing whether she would ever return. Was there anything that could prepare someone for that moment? Finally, Trisha came home to find an envelope on the kitchen counter addressed to her. Dear Miss Eldon, I do indeed recognize that address. I was a young man in that very apartment. I sometimes imagine the person who might find my message, but I never imagined the person would find me. I have photographs of that time, if you would like to visit me. Marcus Jones. Trisha knew actually what to do. Trisha cradled a wrapped package while her mom checked in at the retirement home where Mr. Jones had invited them to visit. After a few moments, the nurse led them to a small sunny room where a slim man in his 90s was standing by the window. The nurse introduced them, and Mr. Jones gestured for Trisha and her mom to sit on the low sofa. An album of old photos lay open on a table. I found some pictures from that old building. He gently touched on the photos. Here's me in my uniform. The young man in the picture stood straight, and his face was somber. The student of their building looked just the same. Trisha didn't know what to ask first. You didn't miss home? She blurted. Actually, I missed it every day. Mr. Jones laughed. That isn't what you wrote, though, Trisha said, handing him the package. Mr. Jones peeled back the paper and gasped. It was a framed photo of the message from Trisha's closet. Mr. Jones traced the letters with a finger and his eyes grew distant. Before the war, I had never been outside New York, Mr. Jones explained. All I wanted to do was leave the Bronx and see the rest of the world. After the war, I realized that I did miss the Bronx. No other place had that energy, no other place was home. I hear things are changed and lots of young families are moving in. Mr. Jones looked at Trisha. How does the old neighborhood seem? Trisha smiled. Like home.